history, there have been countless creepy, sick, and obviously cruel things that have happened. Most of the time we learn about them in history class, but what about all the stuff they didn't tell you about? Well, today we are diving back into those history books to take a look at some of the most unsettling things that have ever happened. And make sure to let me know in the comments if you can think of any more crazy historical facts. Starting off at number 10, vampire killings. So starting us off, we have the supposed vampire killings from the 1800s. Now, spoiler alert here, they weren't actually vampires. Well, I guess I don't know that for sure, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say they weren't. Anyways, back in the 1800s, people in New England believed that cadavers were rising from their graves at night and preying on the living. So to solve this problem, they began exhuming the cadavers. Now, some kept it simple and just turned the cadaver face down, but others jumped to more extreme methods like ripping the bones apart and rearranging them, or burning the deceased person's heart and inhaling the smoke. Apparently at the time, it was believed inhaling the smoke cured tuberculosis, though I can only imagine it made matters much worse for them. Some towns were so into the ritual that they would even hold festivals during the process and celebrate the exhumation and subsequent destruction of the corpses altogether. So while it was incredibly unsettling, they did truly believe they were vampires haunting them in the night, so I guess it gave them some peace of mind. Next up at number 9, dentures. While today dentures are made from composite resin or sometimes porcelain, during the 18th and 19th centuries, of course, those materials weren't available. But as you can imagine, people were still losing teeth at an even higher rate due to the high sugar diet, attempted teeth whitening, which was really just wearing away their enamel instead of brightening it, and the overall lack of knowledge around hygiene. So dentures were still needed and wanted by many. So what was their material of choice? Well, for the easiest and most profitable route, many would acquire the teeth from dead bodies. Although if you had some money, you might be able to afford dentures made from ivory. Other materials were sometimes the teeth of animals or wood, but honestly, I think we can all agree that none of those sound like terribly sanitary options, considering professional physicians at the time weren't sterilizing instruments, and some didn't even believe in disinfecting prior to surgery. Next up at number 8, stained glass. If you walk into just about any old church, you'll notice the walls are decorated with beautiful stained glass. But what might surprise you is that in some of the particularly older pieces, there is a strange ingredient that helps it all come together. In 1112, a German monk wrote about the process of creating the beautifully colored glass, and as he detailed, it starts off, innocently enough, adding sand and potash at a high temp until it becomes molten. From there, they'd add a stabilizer before coloring the glass with different metallic oxides like copper, cobalt, and gold. But once the glass was cooled and shaped, the small details were added by paint. They made the paint usually from lead or copper and would then suspend it in urine. So quite literally, some of those old stained glass windows were painted with pea paint, which I mean kind of just makes me giggle if I'm honest, but it is definitely a weird ingredient to think about being in paint. Coming in at number 7, leather-bound books. Nowadays, it's unusual to even find real leather on anything, but once upon a time, the leather on books wasn't even from cows. It was from people. Called anthropodermic bibliopegi, the books were made in a similar way as they would now, but obviously with one huge difference. They used human skin instead of an animal. While there are actually only 18 confirmed books of its kind that still exist, we have no idea just how many there could have been all those years ago. Allegedly, the books were usually made from executed convicts, and during the French Revolution, there were rumors that a tannery for human skin was established outside of Paris. I mean, it kind of gives me the willies to think about it, and I'm just glad we've moved on to a different material to bind our books today. Next up at number 6, Minnie Dean. Wilhelmina Dean, or Minnie as she was often referred to, was a nanny in New Zealand during 1880 and was a well-known caretaker in her town. But something was off with the woman, and soon she began having quite the dark spot on her name and career. In 1889, one of the young people under her care suddenly died, as if out of nowhere, and initially it was viewed as a freak accident, but 2 years later the same thing happened again. Now, with 2 minors perished under her care, police decided to investigate further into the matter. After a bit of sleuthing, it was concluded that under Minnie's care, the 2 minors were as she was attempting to take out life insurance on them. Police immediately took the remaining young boy in her care, finding it in dirty clothes and drinking curdled milk. By 1895, the investigation into her crimes continued, and she was spotted trying to flee on a train with another victim in her arms. And when police searched her house, they found 3 more covered up victims. Eventually found guilty for all her crimes, she was the first and only woman ever hanged in New Zealand.
So we've all heard of Neanderthals, but there were other early human species, some of which were roaming around at the same time as us as well. One of these were the Denisovans, which were only recently discovered in 2010. Out of all the types of archaeological finds, I think discovering a new subspecies of archaic human would be the most fascinating. It's just wild to think that at one time there were different species of humans living on the planet. An ancient female finger bone had been found in a cave called Denisova in Siberia in 2008. In 2010, mitochondrial DNA was extracted, which pointed to the bone coming from an undiscovered species, now known as the Denisovan. Also inside the cave were Neanderthal remains, meaning the 2 species may have coexisted. The Denisovans lived across Asia from 285 to 25,000 years ago and would have interbred with modern humans, as there are small traces of their DNA in us today, mostly in Malaysians and Aboriginal Australians. They also interbred with Neanderthals. In 2012, in that same cave in Siberia, the fossil specimen of a young half Denisovan, half Neanderthal female was discovered, which they named Denny. She's the only first-generation hybrid hominin that's ever been discovered.
For many years, it was believed that slaves were forced to build the pyramids against their will, under the harsh conditions of the desert sun and in fear of extreme and painful punishment. Well, according to a recent discovery, that might not have actually been the case. At the turn of the 21st century, an ancient cemetery was discovered in Giza that historians believe disprove the forced labor theory and instead support a much more peaceful illustration of the past, in which workers were able to take breaks at will and were actually praised for their service in creating the Great Pyramid. So why do they think this? Well, because the cemetery revealed that those who died while working on the Great Pyramids were given honorable burials close to the royal tombs they helped to construct. Persons found in the cemetery had also been buried with gifts, such as jars of beer and bread, to aid them in their journey to the afterlife. If they were slaves, they would have received no such luxuries. The simple discovery has changed historians' entire understanding of social class in the deserts of ancient Egypt.
These Indonesian cave paintings may be the oldest in the world. In 2014, a bunch of ancient cave paintings were discovered in a cave in Sulawesi Island. They were determined to be between 40 to 50,000 years old, making them thousands of years older than the oldest known cave art at the time. Before this discovery, it was thought that the oldest cave art had been created in Europe, but based on the findings in Indonesia, that's clearly not the case. As archaeologist Adam Brum, who discovered the painting, stated, it adds to the evidence that the first modern human cave art traditions did not arise in Ice Age Europe, as long assumed, but an earlier point in the human journey. The paintings are pretty spectacular too. It's all pretty clear considering how ancient it is. There are human-like figures, there's these 3 big pig-like creatures, tons of human hand stencils. I mean, how amazing would it be to step into a cave and look at handprints made by people living 50,000 years ago. And we're kicking off this list with the Attack of the Dead Men. Now, I learned about this from a song by Sabaton, awesome band, definitely check them out, but it's based on a real-life battle that took place between the Germans and the Russians in World War I. On August 6, 1915, the Germans had unleashed a barrage of poison gases on the enemy before beginning their advance. They didn't think they were going to come up against much resistance, if any at all, but they were wrong. From the smoke and ashes came several Russian survivors. They were coughing up blood and bits of their own lungs. Their skin had begun to decay. They looked like reanimated corpses, and the Germans immediately turned around and just booked it back where they came. They were so frightened that some of them became entangled in their own barbed wire traps, and the Russians started opening fire on the fleeing soldiers. World War I just sounded like literal hell on earth, and the Germans on that day probably thought they were actually seeing the dead come to life. Pretty horrifying. Number 9, Destinies of the Soul. I thought it was only evil books like the legendary Necronomicon that were supposedly bound in human flesh. But it turns out that this was a more common practice than you might think. Destinies of the Soul, published at some point in the 1880s, is just one of the many books that were bound in human skin back in the good old days. And where does this book sit now? Harvard. It's been there since some point in the 1930s. Bound with Human Skin by Dr. Boland, who wrote on the inside stating, "This book is bound in human skin parchment on which no ornament has been stamped to preserve its elegance. By looking carefully, you easily distinguish the pores of the skin. A book about the human soul deserved to have a human covering. I kept this piece of human skin taken from the back of a woman. It is interesting to see the different aspects that change this skin according to the method of preparation to which it is subjected. The practice of binding books this way, it was known as something I can't pronounce." Look it up there. Maybe we'll just write it. I'm not going to bother. It's going to take hours. Anyway, it dates back to the 16th century. Next up, we have the Champa Tiger. In the late 19th to early 20th century, this tigress was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 436 people in Nepal and the Kauman area of India. And that's single-handedly, mind you. This tiger was basically the real-life version of Shere Khan. At the time, her natural habitat was being destroyed to make way for farmland and timber, and many of its natural food sources were being hunted by humans in large numbers, so food was a bit scarce, and in response the tiger decided to just eat humans, and it did. Now, tigers don't often hunt down humans and eat them, but in this case she didn't really have much choice. In 1907, the rogue tiger was finally shot by Jim Corbett, an Indian-born British hunter and tracker. This tiger wasn't the only one he hunted down either. He was a colonel in the British Indian Army and was often called upon to track and slay man-eating tigers and leopards, but none were as tough as the Champa Tiger, who holds the record for the highest human death toll of any single animal. Next up on the list is Terrari. Terrari. He was a guy from France in the late 1700s who became famous or infamous for his super disturbing eating habits. He had this crazy appetite and would eat tons of food, even live animals. He'd gobble down a whole bunch of apples, a meal meant for 15 people. He'd even take to devouring cats and dogs. Terrari didn't stop at regular food though. He once ate a live eel whole and even swallowed a snake after taking off its skin. Doctors and curious people began taking note of him, trying to figure out why he ate like he did. They thought something might be wrong with his stomach that made him feel full and just never gain weight. At one point he was hospitalized and his disturbing behavior just got worse. He was once found eating parts of corpses and drinking human blood. The mystery was never completely solved and he eventually passed away when he was 26. And at number 6 we have Ancient Teeth Whitener. Now this one's just kind of gross, but if you're looking to whiten your teeth and you're on a budget, could be worth a try. Just don't say I recommended it, because I am not. So the Romans used to use urine to whiten their teeth. They dilute it with water or goat's milk and I don't know, I guess swish it around like mouthwash. The thing, it's as nasty as it sounds. It did apparently work. There is ammonia in urine which acts as a cleansing agent. You can find ammonia in cleaning products like glass cleaner, for example, nowadays. Now, I'm not sure what they would have done about their breath. Not much point in having pearly white teeth if you smell like number 1. It's kind of weird to think if you saw someone back then with a nice set of exceptionally bright white teeth in their mouth, you'd think man, that dude swishes a lot of pee. Were people grossed out back then too? Where they're like, oh, here we go again. Gotta whiten these teeth. Things I do for these champas. Or were they just really casual about it? I'm starting to realize why this fact wasn't brought up in school. First of all, you'd never be able to get the class under control. You know, some kid would try it as a dare. The parents would be like, what are you teaching our kids? It would be a whole thing.
At number 10 is Radithor, radioactive water. Yep, you heard that right. Back as recently as the early 20th century, before we knew better, when radioactivity was all the rage, pun intended, some folks believed that ingesting radioactive substances could actually improve your health and cure just about anything. From arthritis to acne, heck, even a cure for impotence, cause why the heck not? It's the 1900s and ain't nobody gonna fact check you. It was like the superhero serum of the time. One particularly famous example was the Radithor, a radon-infused water tonic that was marketed as a health elixir. People chugged this stuff like it was going out of style, believing it would give them a boost of energy and vitality. But hold your horses, champ, cause before you start searching for a bottle of Radithor on eBay, let's talk common sense derived from the benefit of hindsight. While it's true that some forms of radiation can be used for medical purposes today, the kind of radioactivity these historical treatments involved was a whole different story. Ingesting radioactive substances could lead to a host of health issues like tissue damage, cancer, and other not-so-fun side effects. If you're enjoying the video so far, you can support this channel by pressing like, subscribing to Most Amazing, and ringing that notification bell. At number 9 is mummy medicine. Back in the day, mummies were believed to possess mystical healing properties. From ancient Egypt to Europe to Renaissance period, people ground up these preserved bodies into powders or potions, thinking that they could cure anything from headaches to broken bones. Who would have thought that ancient Egyptian pharmacies would sell mummy juice? Now you might be wondering, why on earth would anyone think that ground up mummies could heal them? Well, it all came down to the concept of sympathetic magic. It was the idea that if you consumed a part of a mummy, which was considered to be timeless and preserved, you would gain some of its life force and longevity. Life force from an unalive thing. Yeah. Mummy medicine wasn't just ingested, it was also used topically. People would mix the mummy powder with various substances and apply it to wounds or injuries. It was believed to possess some mystical healing powers that could speed up the recovery process, but here's the kicker. They weren't just using any mummies. No, they had a hierarchy. You see, the best mummies were thought to come from executed criminals. And if you're wondering why, well, it was believed that the unfortunate life circumstances imbued them with extra potency. Plus, if you think that this was just an old world thing, think again, because mummy medicine managed to stick around until the early 20th century. So next time you visit a museum and see a mummy on display, just remember, that thing might have been a key ingredient in someone's headache remedy. Weird, right? At number 8, the electric eel pain relief. Oh boy. When it comes to finding relief from pain, humanity has been pretty creative, but have you ever heard of using electric eels for your pain? So picture this, it's way back in ancient Rome, and you're suffering from some nasty pain. I don't know, maybe you've been carrying bricks on your back all day for that new cathedral. Now you're in the midst of ancient history, my friends, so instead of popping an Advil or calling your family doctor, you find yourself a trusty electric eel. These eels with their electric charges were believed to possess mystical properties. The idea was that letting some of these aquatic shockers zap you, your pain would somehow just disappear. Now it might seem like a bizarre way to handle pain, but as with everything the Romans did, there's a hint of logic behind it. You see, electric eels use electric shots in the wild to navigate and hunt, and some folks thought that by harnessing this natural electric power, you could somehow overwhelm and reset your body's pain signals. Plus, who wouldn't want to be the first in line for a massage from a thunderfish, am I right? But of course, this practice raises more questions than it answers. Did it actually work? Was it safe? And more importantly, did the cure end up being worse than the ailment? Personally, I wouldn't want to test and find out. At number 7 is the smoke enema. Oh boy. Smoke enemas. Quite a head turner when it comes to weird medical practices of the past. You see, throughout history, people have come up with some pretty creative ways to treat various ailments. And I mean, either creative or insane, but I'll let you decide that for yourself down in the comments. Now picture this. It's the 18th century and someone is experiencing, say, a near drowning incident. And what do? Well, according to medical practices at the time, the answer would be to introduce tobacco smoke into the rectum. Yeah, you heard me right, where the sun don't usually shine. The idea behind this was that the smoke would supposedly warm up the body and simulate respiration from your booty? This practice gained quite a following, and even a special gadget called the tobacco smoke enema apparatus was invented for this very purpose. It was basically a bellows connected with a tube that was inserted into the, well, where it shouldn't go, allowing for the smoke to be blown in. While the smoke enema might sound like the kind of quirky solution that would only come from a different era, it's important to note that it wasn't widely accepted or successful as some other treatments. Medical minds at the time eventually realized that this practice wasn't as effective as they had initially hoped, and gradually it went up in smoke, so to speak. At number 6, spider webs for wound dressing. Long ago, in a time before the wonders of modern medicine, people had to make do with what nature provided, and apparently, nature's architects, spiders, spiders were considered quite the medical marvels. Now the concept is surprisingly straightforward. When someone suffered a minor cut or wound, instead of reaching for the nearest bandage, which hadn't been invented yet, they would apply a spider web to the injury. Why, you might ask? Well, spider silk, as it turns out, possesses some rather unique properties. It's incredibly lightweight, yet remarkably strong, and is known for its ability to repel water. This made it an interesting choice for wound care, as the silk's fine structure could potentially create a barrier that kept out dirt and other contaminants while simultaneously still allowing the wound to breathe. But before you go on searching for spiders to create your own DIY wound dressing, let's acknowledge the downsides. Firstly, not all spider silk is created equal. Some spiders produce silk with potential antibacterial properties, while others might do the opposite. So on that note, there's the issue of sanitation. Let's just say those cobwebs you find in the attic might not be the most sterile choice to apply on your open wound. In the grand scheme of things, the idea of using a spider as wound dressings might be more of an interesting historical tidbit than a practical solution in today's world. Modern medicine has thankfully provided us with a plethora of sterile, advanced wound care options that leave the arachnids to their web building pursuits.
We're going to start off with an ancient Greek playwright who died at the hands of a tortoise. I'm going to call this tale The Eagle and the Tortoise, which sounds way cooler than it is. Eagle and Tortoise would also be a great name for a pub. Aeschylus was famous for his Greek tragedies. He's often referred to as the father of tragedy, and nowhere is this more apparent than in his very own death. In 456 or 455 BC, Aeschylus was visiting the city of Gela, but little did he know there was an eagle flying overhead with a tortoise in its talons. The eagle, wanting to crack the tortoise's shell so he could get to all that juicy meat, well, it dropped its prey on a rock down below. Only that rock was actually Aeschylus's bald head. Pretty hilarious way to go, and tragic. Fitting though, comedy and tragedy often intertwine. Next on the list we have the death of the ancient Greek philosopher Pythagoras. This has to be one of the funniest historical deaths I've ever read about. Pythagoras was a very smart man, an interesting man, but he did have some very strange ideas about beans. He believed that humans and beans were related, and he once did an experiment where he buried beans and observed that they looked a lot like human fetuses when unearthed weeks later, according to him anyway. So naturally from that point on, he figured that beans must have souls of their own, so harming or eating them would be incredibly inhumane and even evil. Well, Pythagoras refused to admit a man named Cylon into the commune that he'd built, where everyone would, philosophize, and they were part of this kind of group. Now, Cylon really wanted to be part of this club though, and so he rallied a mob to seek revenge on Pythagoras for refusing to let him to enter. Pythagoras ran for his life, but he soon found himself standing before a field of beans. So now he had this moral conundrum on his hands. Would he run into the field and risk crushing and destroying all these precious lives, or would he just allow himself to be caught? Well, he chose not to cross the field, and he died at the hands of an angry, vengeful mob. Very brave, but hilariously misguided. If you ever feel like you have a hard time letting go of a grudge, you probably don't have anything on Pope Stephen VI, who held what has to be one of the pettiest, most pointless trials in history, all because he didn't like Pope Formosus. Formosus was the head of the Catholic Church from 891 to 896, and after his death, his successor, Pope Stephen VI, decided to put Formosus on trial. But the thing is, Formosus had been dead for about 7 months. In January of 897, the trial began. And did they just, use some sort of symbolic representation of Formosus in court, like prop up a painting of him or something like that? No, that just wouldn't be official enough. So Pope Stephen actually had the guy's rotting corpse exhumed from its grave, which was then propped up on a throne in the courtroom. Classy, right? Then an actual trial took place with a deacon appointed to speak on behalf of Formosus, and the main charges against him were related to political and religious disagreements. He was accused of having unlawfully seized the papacy and of violating church laws. Formosus was found guilty, because, you know, he was a rotting corpse that couldn't actually talk and defend himself. His papacy was now invalid. His body, or what was left of it at this point, was stripped of its robes, and the fingers he used for blessings were cut off. Finally, his body was thrown into the river. This strange event is known as the Cadaver Synod, and as for Pope Stephen VI, he was eventually imprisoned and strangled to death. People weren't really a fan of this whole trial. Next up, we have the rabbit attack. Napoleon Bonaparte had huge triumphs and some even bigger defeats, like at the Battle of Waterloo, for example. But one of his defeats isn't brought up nearly as much in history textbooks, and that's because Napoleon suffered a defeat so embarrassing, so unbelievable, that he must have wanted this scrubbed from the record entirely. But I think everyone surrounding him just found it too funny to forget. In 1807, Napoleon was attacked by an army of rabbits and lost. Napoleon's chief of staff organized a rabbit hunt as a treat for the emperor and some high-ranking military officers. A large number of rabbits were gathered. Some say there were hundreds, others say there were up to 3,000. That was probably just to make him look a little bit better. I doubt there were 3,000 rabbits, but who knows. The rabbits were kept in cages around the edge of a grassy field, ready to be released for the hunt. Now, when Napoleon and his entourage arrived ready for a leisurely hunt, the rabbits were set loose, but instead of scattering in fear, the rabbits ended up charging straight at Napoleon and his men. At first, everyone laughed at the sight of all these cute bunnies hopping towards them, but as more and more rabbits started swarming, it became clear to the men that they actually needed to act. Napoleon's men tried to fend off the bunnies with sticks, and the coachmen cracked their whips to try and scare them away, but the rabbits were relentless. Alright, how insane is this? Nintendo was around at the same time Jack the Ripper was stalking the streets. Yeah, Nintendo's actually been around since the 80s. The 1880s. It was founded in 1889 in Japan by a craftsman named Fusijiro Yamauchi. Of course, the company really took off in 1981 with Donkey Kong and Super Mario Bros. A few years later, but they started out making handcrafted playing cards in the late 1800s. The Ripper's spree was carried out in 1888, but not only was he still being whispered about in the streets and written about in the paper at the time, but there were several killings lasting into the early 1890s that some people speculated the Ripper was responsible for. Nintendo and Jack the Ripper, two things I would have never associated with each other. Very weird to picture a company that feels so contemporary being around at the same time as the man who's often referred to as the first modern day serial killer. Star Wars and the Guillotine. Or guillotine. Some people say it either way. Star Wars, one of the first modern day blockbusters. It spawned a whole new genre of cinema. It's probably the most iconic film franchise in history. Star Wars is old by like Gen Z standards, like sure, but in the grand scheme of things, it's very modern. People are still fans to this day. Disney churns out subpar Star Wars content like every month, so it may be kind of surprising to learn that the first Star Wars movie came out the same year that France carried out its last execution by guillotine. Yeah, what a weird clash that is. A movie that helped spawn the modern special effects driven blockbusters full of actors that are still alive and working today, and an execution method that we often associate with this long forgotten time. But no, 1977 marked the end, apparently. In fact, it wasn't even abolished until 1981. 77 was just the final time it was actually used. McDonald's also has a bit of a connection to killing people, not because of how deadly the food is, but because the first McD's opened in 1940, just a year after the last public execution by guillotine was carried out in France. Keyword there being public. The one in 1977 wasn't public. How do you think folks in England traveled to check out the last public hanging in the country? By foot? Horse and buggy? Well, maybe, but another method of transportation would have been used. The subway. Yeah. Pretty weird to think about, but you could have taken the London Underground to watch England's last public hanging on May 26th of 1868. The Underground, which is now used by Londoners on the daily to get around the city, had already been operating for 5 years by then. It first opened in 1863, changing the way people traveled in London. And by 1868, public executions were still a thing, and a huge crowd gathered to watch the hanging of Michael Barrett, an Irish nationalist, outside Newgate Prison. Just imagine hopping on a tube train, which we associate heavily with modern life, to witness something as grim and old-fashioned as a public hanging. Feels like two different worlds colliding a little bit. Today we see the subway as this symbol of progress and everyday convenience, but public hangings, just like the guillotine I mentioned earlier, feels like a more dark, distant part of our history. Just goes to show that there really isn't this clear cutoff between what's old in our history and what's new. There's a lot more overlap than we often think, which, I mean, of course there is. Time is just this ever-flowing thing, but it's just weird when you step back and you put it all into perspective. Does it get any more delicious than an Oreo cookie? Even in a life and death situation, I could go for one of these. Too bad those violin players on the Titanic didn't have an Oreo cookie to bite into right before playing out their last tune as the ship started to go down. Turns out they could have, though. The first Oreo cookie was sold the same year the Titanic sunk. In fact, Oreo came out about a month before 1,500 people died in the accident. But as my buddy told me the day he got back from his grandfather's funeral, I did get these nice dress pants out of it, so you win some, you lose some. Now, I said the folks on the Titanic could have had an Oreo. It's not exactly true. They weren't available overseas yet. If they had made it to their destination, they could have tried one, but instead of dunking a delicious cookie in a cool glass of milk, they were dunked themselves into ice-cold water, never to return. Thus is life. Cleopatra, the legendary Egyptian queen, is often, rightfully so, associated with the pyramids, but she actually lived closer to a more modern historical event than the construction of the Great Pyramids. Believe it or not, but Cleopatra lived closer to the first moon landing than the building of the pyramids in Giza. How nuts is that to think about? She lived from 69 to 30 BC, but the pyramids had been constructed long before her, from about 2550 to 2490 BC. 1969 was closer by a pretty hefty chunk. The moon landing happened 1,999 years after her death, while the pyramids were completed 2,400 years before she was born. In this same vein, the pyramids were considered ancient to the ancient Romans. That's odd to think about too. Speaking of the pyramids, let's talk about woolly mammoths. Now, I know what you're thinking out there. What do these things have to do with each other? Well, there were still woolly mammoths roaming around Earth while the pyramids were being built. That's how old the pyramids really are, which is why they're often regarded as one of the most incredible wonders of the world. I mean, no wonder some folks think there's just no way human beings constructed them on their own without some sort of outside assistance from some advanced alien species or something. A lot of people think the mammoths died about 10,000 years ago, and that was that, but a small number of them survived in several places for another 6,000 years or so. In fact, a population of woolly mammoths roamed Wrangel Island off the coast of Siberia as recently as 3,700 years ago. So even centuries after the Great Pyramid of Giza and Stonehenge was completed, these prehistoric mammoths were still roaming the earth. What do you think is older, Oxford University or the Aztec Empire? Yeah, it's Oxford. It's pretty wild to think about, but Oxford University is actually older than the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs, who are famous for their impressive temples and all their rich culture, they started building their capital city, Tenochtitlan, in 1325. That's the same place we now call Mexico City. Meanwhile, over in England, Oxford University had already been up and running since 1096. That's just crazy to think about. While Oxford students were hitting the books, the Aztecs were just beginning to lay the foundations of their empire. How's this for a dark ritual? Cutting off your own reproductive organs to appease your favorite god. Sounds pretty extreme. Worshippers of Cybele, the god of motherhood, nature, fertility, and agriculture, took their faith to the extreme. Forget human sacrifice. I mean, that's so passé. Gotta sacrifice your own ability to create human life. Painfully. That's how you really impress the gods. Cybele was originally worshipped in the kingdom and Phrygia, but eventually the Greeks Greeks and Romans adapted her into their own beliefs, and the Cybele cult spread. March 24th was a very special holiday for the followers. It was known as the Day of BLOOD, which involved a lot more than the name suggests, because this was the day that priests would castrate themselves, offering up their round little sacrifices to Cybele's altars in a joyous celebration of the mother of all gods. Eventually, bulls would be sacrificed rather than bullocks. The ancient Romans, they really weren't big fans of castration and thought the cult was kinda nuts. So they were like, if you want to keep doing your thing, you can't cut off your things, you're gonna have to settle for animal sacrifices instead.
The Anthill cult is another lesser-known cult with some less than savory practices and rituals. The organization was founded in 1977 in Canada by its leader Roch Thériault, a self-proclaimed prophet. It was a doomsday cult with beliefs based in, but rituals incredibly removed from Christianity. The founder was known for having multiple wives and even more offspring. In total, Roch fathered 26 individuals. He was a terrible man who subjected his followers to routine physical and psychological torment. The term anthill comes from Roch's view on his followers, who were forced to build the cult's town while he relaxed, during which time he compared them to ants working in an anthill. By the 1980s, the cult had almost 40 members, forced to wear identical tunics to represent both their dedication to the cult and equality among members. In 1984, the group moved to Quebec, during which time Roch's grasp around the lives of the members tightened as his torments grew. He became a self-proclaimed surgeon, removing limbs, teeth, fingers, and toes from his followers in what he described as a ritualistic sacrificial practice. He also ordered many of his followers to break their own limbs, injure one another, and ingest human excrement, insect, and rats. In 1989, Roch was arrested after one of his former members, Eleazar, fled the commune and contacted authorities. It was her second attempt at escape. She had tried once before, but it ended far too horribly to get into on this platform. Roch was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his torment of Eleazar and the killing of another former member. In 2002, he applied and was rejected for parole, as he was considered high risk to reoffend. I love it when they keep the bad guys in jail.
Around 7,000 years ago, a large meteorite broke up as it plummeted towards the Earth, crashing into Estonia. This created 9 craters, which became known as the Cali Craters. The main crater, which is often what people are talking about when they say the Cali Crater, is almost perfectly circular, and at one point there was a wall built around it, which led many archaeologists to believe that the people at the time incorporated it into rituals of some kind, which involved human sacrifice. Human bones were recovered from under the water. So this wall around it was around 1,540 feet long and just over 6.5 feet in height. We don't know exactly what the people would have believed about the crater, but I'm sure watching a giant boulder crash into the ground 7,000 years ago must have seemed like a sign from a higher power. So maybe in order to avoid more giant rocks from the sky raining down on their heads in the future, they decided to offer up sacrifices in order to appease whatever deity they thought was responsible.
The Church of Yahweh has been referred to as a cult by many of its former members, although naturally the organization claims otherwise. The Church of Yahweh was founded by Michael Wayne Ryan, who also led the Christian identity cult. Some of Ryan's main teachings were sick combinations of racist ideologies, homophobia, and anti-traitor propaganda, with the group's core message being that they had been chosen by God and that anyone who identified outside of their race, class, and creed were children of Satan, in accordance with the serpent seed theory, which is a fringe belief that the fall of man came about because Eve mated with the serpent in the Garden of Eden. It's super convoluted. During his time as a cult leader, Ryan convinced his followers to steal, lie, and just generally hate everyone that wasn't them. And by the time police infiltrated the organization, the Church of Yahweh had collected an entire stockpile of weapons that they had planned on using for the imminent Battle of Armageddon. The cult finally fell apart after word got out that not only was Ryan brainwashing his disciples, in some cases he was killing them too, ritualistically tormenting them for several days, firing off their fingertips, breaking their legs, and even removing the skin from their bodies before finally putting them out of their misery. Ryan was arrested in 1985, and in 2015 he died while on death row at the age of 67.
In ancient Greece, around 2,000 years ago, people were facing all sorts of health issues. Modern medicine as we know it was still centuries away, so they turned to their gods for help. Mainly Asclepius, the god of healing and medicine. It was believed that Asclepius had the power to cure illness and even bring people back from the dead. To worship Asclepius, people would visit special healing temples called Asclepia, which were scattered throughout Greece. These were almost like ancient hospitals, but combined into religious temples, a blend of a spiritual retreat and a medical facility. At these sanctuaries, the main ritual was something called incubation. You'd make a pilgrimage to one of these temples, hoping for a miraculous cure. Once you arrived, you'd spend the night in a sacred dormitory or sleeping area, often on a special bed or mat. And the hope was that during the night, Asclepius would visit you in your dreams and offer guidance or a cure for your illness. If you had a dream of Asclepius or saw a vision related to healing of some sort, the priests would analyze the dream, and then based on that, they'd suggest a treatment or ritual to follow. Unfortunately, I don't think this would have worked very well. Alright, so this first one is completely nuts. At one point, the CIA came up with a plan to take out Fidel Castro with an exploding seashell. I am not making this up for clicks. I know it sounds like Saturday morning, like cartoon lunacy, but this really did happen. The US government attempted to take this guy's life apparently hundreds of times, and he just kept managing to dodge the attempts. They started getting pretty creative. I mean, they had to at some point. Exploding cigars, a poisoned diving suit, poison in face cream. The list goes on, but the exploding seashell has to be one of the strangest, and I want to say ill thought out. Like, listen to this plan and tell me it's not a bit of a stretch. So Castro was an avid diver, so the CIA rigged this brightly colored conch shell with an explosive and placed it in one of his favorite diving spots. So the hope was that he'd go to this particular diving spot, find the shell, decide to pick it up, not to mention someone else could have dove into that spot first and found the shell. So yeah, this plan was scrapped for very good reason.
Speaking of completely nuts, up next we have a pretty nasty experiment that took place between 1913 and 1951 and involved testicular transplants. During that time, eugenicist Leo Stanley was the chief surgeon at San Quentin State Prison, aka Cali's oldest correctional facility. The guy was a freak. He started off his career by performing vasectomies on inmates, but soon turned his interests elsewhere. He became fascinated by the effects of aging, believing that decreased hormones contributed to criminality, weak morality, and poor physical attributes. His solution? Yep, trading testes. Stanley began using the testicles of executed male prisoners and transplanting them into older men in an attempt to restore their masculinity. Guess what? It gets worse. Apparently so many people signed up for this treatment that Stanley ran into an issue. He had a supply shortage. His solution? Animals. Oh, but wait, there's more. Eventually Stanley got lazy, and so instead of performing a proper transplant, he instead ground up the animals' parts into a paste, and then he injected that paste into the men's abdomens. Procedure count? 10,000. Wacko nut job? Yes.
Alright, next up, spy cats. Yeah, that's right. The CIA also tried to train cats as spies during the Cold War. There needs to be a cartoon about this, I think. At the beginning, it could actually say, like, based on true events. Anyway, it does sound like a Ninja Turtles ripoff, but this actually was a thing. Project Acoustic Kitty was a CIA project that set out to use cats to spy on the Kremlin and Soviet embassies in the 60s. They had a vet implant a microphone in a cat's ear canal along with a tiny radio transmitter at the base of its skull, so that the cat was set up to record and transmit audio. Its first mission? Eavesdrop on two men at a park outside the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. The mission was not a success. As soon as the cat was released, it was run over by a taxi. Further attempts were made. Oh God, I'm sorry. That's funny. Further attempts were made with other cats, but the problem was they were too distracted to be of any use, and nothing productive came of this $20 million project. Yeah, I mean, cats. Why cats? Like, they're just, they do their own thing, man. They're heart, you can't train them. Acoustic Kitty came to a halt in 1967. The whole thing was a complete secret until 2001 when the CIA documents were declassified.
Okay, next up we have another pretty shady dude who also worked at a prison. Oncologist Chester Southam, working at Sloan Kettering Institute during the 1950s and 60s. What made this guy so bad? Well, he has been known to inject patients with live cancer cells without their permission and against their will. He originally implanted the cells into people who had already received terminal cancer diagnosis, but of course he later went on to inject the cells into healthy subjects instead. His goal in all of this was to see how the immune system reacted to the cells. The answer, not well, albeit the healthy people had better results than those who suffered from already terminal illnesses. Eventually, the doctor went back to treating sick individuals, this time at the Jewish Chronic Disease Hospital in Brooklyn, New York. But it was here that his experimentation was met with resistance, obviously, and it was revealed to the public. The result, a big fat lawsuit, and his medical license being suspended for 1 year, which was later reduced to a probation. He continued to study and practice medicine. That's insane. What the heck?
The Curse of Tamerlane's Tomb is one of those eerie tales that makes you wonder if history sometimes has a supernatural twist. In 1941, Soviet archaeologists decided to open the tomb of Tamerlane, a formidable 14th century Turco-Mongol conqueror. Inside, they found a chilling inscription that read, quote, "Whomsoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." Just 3 days later, an invasion of the Soviet Union began, leading many to believe that the curse had been triggered by disturbing the tomb. The timing was so uncanny that it's hard not to see it as something more than just coincidence. Interestingly, the curse is also linked to the Soviet victory in a major battle, which some attribute to Tamerlane's remains being reburied, according to Islamic tradition, shortly before the tide turned. Whether you believe in curses or not, the story of Tamerlane's tomb certainly adds a mysterious layer to the events of that extremely turbulent time in history. The King Umberto I coincidence is one of those stories that feels like it could only happen in a novel, but it's actually entirely true. In 1900, King Umberto I of Italy decided to dine at a small restaurant where he was astonished to find that the owner was his exact double. But the similarities didn't stop there. Both men shared the same name, were born on the same day in the same town, and even married women named Margarita. It's the kind of coincidence that makes you question whether the universe was playing some kind of cosmic joke. The next day, things took an even stranger turn. The restaurant owner was tragically shot and killed. Later, that very same day, King Umberto I met a similar fate as he was assassinated during a public event. The bizarre series of events leaves us wondering if this was more than just chance, a glitch in reality where two identical lives were eerily intertwined and ended in the same tragic manner. I don't know, it's insane. Like, I can't explain that at all. Not even the death thing is like crazy, but it's like, how do they have the same name, born on the same day, in the same town, married people of the same name? Like, that just, it's too much for me. The cross-country coincidence is one of those stories that seems too strange to be true. In 1975, Erskine Lawrence Eben was tragically struck and killed by a taxi while riding his moped in Bermuda. What makes this incident truly mind-boggling is that it was an almost exact replay of a tragedy that occurred exactly 1 year earlier. In 1974, Erskine's brother Neville was also riding that same moped in the same intersection when he was killed by the same taxi, driven by the same driver and even carrying the same passenger. I could not have said same more in that sentence. The chances of such a precise and tragic repetition are so astronomically low that it feels like reality just momentarily glitched, playing out the same fatal scenario twice as if stuck in a loop. It's like a nightmare Groundhog Day. This eerie coincidence leaves us wondering if there's something more at play, something beyond mere chance that defies our understanding of how the world works. If anybody knows, let me know. The phantom time hypothesis is one of the most mind-bending ideas to come out of historical theory, almost like it's from a science fiction novel. Proposed by historian Herbert Illig, this theory suggests that the period between 614 and 911 AD never actually happened. That it was just entirely fabricated. According to Illig, this would mean that we're not actually living in 2024, but rather in 1727, with nearly 300 years of history being nothing more than an elaborate collective illusion. The implications of this theory are staggering, as it would mean that events like Charlemagne's reign and the early Middle Ages were either exaggerated or just completely invented. This idea of a massive historical glitch where entire centuries were inserted into the timeline challenges everything we think we know about history. While mainstream historians remain skeptical, the phantom time hypothesis continues to fascinate those who enjoy pondering whether our understanding of the past, and by extension, our present, might be based on a glitch in reality itself. Just one other thing to send me into an existential crisis. I love it. Alright. The mystery of the London Hammer is one of those puzzling discoveries that challenges our understanding of history and just leaves us questioning reality itself. In 1936, a hammer was found in London, Texas, but this wasn't just any ordinary tool. The hammer was embedded in rock that, according to geological estimates, is around 400 million years old. An era long before humans, let alone their tools, were supposed to exist. This bizarre find has baffled scientists and sparked all sorts of theories, from the possibility of time slips to the idea of alternate realities where different timelines somehow intersected. How could a man-made object end up trapped in ancient rock? The hammer's presence in such an anachronistic setting is more than just a curiosity, it is a mystery that seems to defy the laws of time and logic, making me wonder if it's evidence of a glitch in the fabric of reality itself. I don't know. I can't explain any of these things we're speaking about. I'm just here to report the news and then stress about it later.
Coming in at number 10 is the Melon Heads. It said if you drive through Lake County, Ohio late at night and happen to see something that resembles a pack of people with huge heads staring at you from the tall grass, you may have stumbled across the Melon Heads of Ohio. Allegedly, the government ran a number of experiments which eventually left a group of humans with heads swelled to enormous sizes. Now obviously, the government found little to do with these now deformed people, so the story goes that they got dumped off in the woods near Kirtland, Ohio, not far from Cleveland. But because every story gets retold, more paranormal theories have been proposed about the Melon Heads. Some believe them to be the ghosts of young subjects who burned to death in a cabin fire. Now it's said that they were subjected to tests by a man named Dr. Crow, whose work caused their heads to inflate to their larger size. Now regardless of their origins, the Melon Heads get sighted most at Windsor Road, where many high schoolers go and attempt to witness them firsthand. Now to me, that sounds absolutely terrifying, and if I ever go to Ohio, I will be avoiding that area completely. Number 9. Helltown. With a name like Helltown, it's no shock that this town had terrible things happen. Founded in 1806, Boston Village's original claim to fame was its standing as the oldest village in Summit County. But in 1974, it became the unlucky victim of nationwide anxiety over the county's disappearing forest land. The land was then given to the National Park Services, and they decided it would be home to a new park. The government began buying the properties of its longtime residents, and then, of course, the government quickly fell behind on its plan to create the park, and the village sat neglected. Now the hellish aura of the area only continued to grow when they also acquired the Kredgy dump in 1985. Rangers visiting the site became ill and covered in rashes. It was soon discovered that the dump was highly polluted with toxic chemicals improperly disposed of. Also in the village there is a church, which is said to have been built by Satanists, complete with upside down crosses. There's an abandoned bus that is said to be the host of lingering ghosts, and there is a talk of mutants who were created by the chemical spill, including the monstrous snake known as the Peninsula Python. Number 8. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run was an identified serial slayer who was active in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1930s. The deaths are characterized by the dismemberment of 13 known victims and the disposal of their remains in the impoverished neighborhood of Kingsbury Run. Now, most victims came from an area east of Kingsbury Run called the Roaring Third or Hobo Jungle, known for its bars, gambling, dens, brothels, and vagrants. Now, many of the victims remain unidentified to this day, and despite an investigation of the deaths, which at one time was led by famed lawman Elliot Ness, then Cleveland's public safety director, the criminal responsible was never apprehended. Now, recent speculation suggests that the butcher may have traveled west and was also responsible for the death of Elizabeth Short of the Black Dahlia murder case. Number 7. The Circleville letter writer. In the 1970s, residents of a small town of Circleville in Pickaway County started receiving personal, mysterious letters about their lives. Now, the letters were written in block style and contained vindictive, violent, and often vulgar material. School bus driver Mary Glipsy became the main target of the letters. The writer accused Mary, who was married, to having an affair with a married school superintendent, Gordon Massey. Now, the letters sent to Mary didn't stop, and they became increasingly threatening. Her husband, Ronald Glipsy, began receiving them too. Then in August 1977, Ronald died, and it was unknown whether the death was accidental or a homicide, but it was believed the letters were related to his death. The letters continued even after a suspect was placed in prison, and the letters continued to arrive in residents' mailboxes, both city officials and average citizens alike, until the late 90s. The writer was never revealed, and it remains an Ohio mystery to this day. Number 6. The Legend of Elizabeth's Grave. This infamous legend starts at Mount Union Pleasant Valley Cemetery, one of the most haunted cemeteries in Ohio. The rural cemetery is home to the chilling Elizabeth's grave. Now, there are two major stories to Elizabeth's legend. In the first, Elizabeth, overcome with grief over the death of her husband, hanged herself from a tree near the rear of the cemetery in which her husband was buried. In another variation, Elizabeth had her life ended in a similar manner by several men angry over her inheritance upon her husband's death. Now, in both legends, the story goes that Elizabeth was buried near the front of the cemetery. However, her tombstone mysteriously moves itself to the back of the cemetery near the location of her death, most often against the very tree from which she hung. When replaced, it would always wander back to the rear of the cemetery. Now, that's not all. It's rumored that Elizabeth still walks the cemetery, often seen in a white dress. A few people claim that apparitions of Elizabeth are accompanied by the apparitions of two shadowy men dressed in all black. Sometimes she's seen hanging from the tree where she lost her life, and some even say that on the anniversary of her death, blood drips from the tree in question.
Kicking things off today, we have July 11th, 1991, and the Mayan Calendar. On July 11th of 1991, a bunch of UFOs lit up the skies above Mexico City during a total solar eclipse. Thousands of people reported seeing a large metallic disc in the sky. Not only that, but footage of the object was captured and even broadcasted on the news. It was the first widely reported UFO sighting in Mexico City, which since that day has become a hotbed for UFO and unexplainable extraterrestrial activity. So what does this have to do with the Mayan calendar? Well, the calendar told of the July 11th eclipse, calling it the sixth sun of Quetzalcoatl, and claiming that it would bring about change and cosmic awareness, which I honestly think it's safe to say it did. Whether or not the calendar accurately predicting the events of July 11th is just some strange coincidence, or if the Mayans really did mean to calculate aliens' first major coming to Earth, for now remains a mystery. But I hope not for long, because personally, I am super eager to know more.
Alright, this next one is almost too incredible to be a mere coincidence. I'd love to see someone try and break this down and have it make any logical sense. This is the story of two twin brothers separated at birth who grew up and reunited as adults, only to find that they'd basically led identical lives. They were born in 1940 and adopted into different families in Ohio. The twins had no contact with each other for nearly 4 decades, but when they finally reunited, the similarities in their lives were just too uncanny. Both were named James by their adoptive parents, which, alright, common but incredibly awesome name, and everyone named James is a winner, but, not all that crazy. There's more though. Growing up about 40 miles apart, they both went by the nickname Jim, and each brother would go on to marry a woman named Linda. After divorcing their first wives, both Jims found love again with women named Betty. Both also had sons who they each named James Allen. They also both had dogs. And what were their dogs' names? Well, one was named Toy and the other was named Toy. I'd get it if you named your dog Skipper or something like that, typical dog name, but Toy? That's odd. Both brothers also enjoyed woodworking and had a penchant for mechanical drawing. Even their choice of vacation spots matched up. Both Jims would often go to the same Florida beach. Their health habits were similar. Both had a history of headaches, smoked the same brand of cigarettes, and even gained and lost weight around the same periods in their lives. When Jim Lewis and Jim Springer finally met in 1979 at the age of 39, it was like they were looking at a slightly alternate reality version of themselves. The case of these twins is a pretty fascinating study on how much of our behavior and preferences might be hardwired into our DNA.
Next up, we have the strange life of Violet Jessup, who, during her time working as an ocean liner stewardess, was present for 3 separate ocean disasters, all on Olympic-class ocean liners, including one of the most famous disasters, the sinking of the RMS Titanic. On June 14th of 1991, Jessup was aboard the RMS Olympic when it crashed with the ocean cruiser HMA Hawk. The Olympic, which was at the time of the incident the largest civilian liner in the world, suffered heavy damage and flooded in the crash, but luckily it was able to make it back to Southampton and no one was killed or even seriously injured. On April 10th of 1912, Jessup was working as a stewardess on the RMS Titanic when it hit an iceberg and sank just 4 days into its maiden voyage. Luckily, she was able to board one of the ship's lifeboats and she made it safely to shore. 4 years later, on November 21st of 1916, Jessup was working aboard the HMHS Britannic when the ship hit a mine and sank in the Aegean Sea. It was the largest ship to be lost during the First World War. As the ship sank, Jessup attempted to jump to safety, but instead hit her head on the ship's keel. She did, however, resurfaced, was rescued, and survived. This girl's got 9 lives, or at least 3.
Speaking of the Titanic though, let's talk about a little novella called Futility. After the sinking of the Titanic, folks were quick to point out the eerie similarities between the circumstances surrounding the real-life disaster and a fictional novella written by American author Morgan Robertson, which was written in 1898, 14 years before the sinking of the unsinkable ship. So what were the similarities? Well, the story describes a big British passenger liner called the Titan that is deemed unsinkable, but strikes an iceberg and sinks. Not only that, but the ship in the story doesn't have enough lifeboats and sinks in April in the North Atlantic Ocean. All the circumstances I listed there, other than the difference in the name of the ships, is identical to what happened in real life in 1912.
Got a sinking feeling about that one. Next up on our list today, we have the coincidental closeness of the rare Chelyabinsk meteor and the 2012 DA-14 asteroid, 2 incredibly rare events that occurred 16 hours apart on the exact same day, but seemingly had nothing to do with one another. On February 15th of 2013, an asteroid entered into Earth's atmosphere over the southern region of Russia and exploded, with a force equal to 20 to 30 of the atomic bombs used at Hiroshima. 1,500 people were wounded, and 7,000 buildings experienced varying degrees of damage as a result. After the explosion, the ground below was hot and the entire affected area smelled like smoke. As I said, something like this is extremely rare, and the event was also the only time in history that a meteor has been known to cause human injury. Not only that, but the meteor was not detected by authorities prior to it entering into the atmosphere. If that's not crazy enough, just 16 hours later, another asteroid named 2012 DA-14 came within 27,700 meters, 17,200 miles, of the surface of Earth, making it the closest asteroid of its size to have ever been recorded in modern times.
I'm gonna call this next story the real-life Final Destination, because it sounds like a death you'd see in Final Destination. That's a movie you've seen, right?
No.
Anyway, this guy just could not escape the fate that was waiting for him. Henry Ziegland was born in 1861 in Honey Grove, Texas. He was a farmer who began dating a woman named Charla Karras. They lived together for a time, but in 1883, Henry dumped her. This left Charla utterly devastated, and in her despair, she ended up taking her own life. Charla's brother was filled with rage and blamed Henry for her death, and he decided he was going to take his revenge. So one day he snuck into Henry's barn while he was tending to the horses and fired at him. The bullet grazed Henry, who then pretended to be dead. Believing he had killed Henry, the brother then turned the firearm on himself. Little did Henry know, but the bullet had lodged into a tree by the barn. Now, 20 years went by, and Henry decided to cut down a tree in front of his barn. It was too thick to cut with an axe, so he opted for dynamite. When the dynamite went off, Henry was killed instantly. Not from the explosion, he was a fair distance away, but from the bullet that had been lodged into the tree 2 decades earlier.
Next up, we have the strange life of Robert Todd Lincoln, or should I say strange saving. As we all should know, the 16th President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth in a theater on April 14th of 1865. What you might not know is that during his presidency, Lincoln actually bore witness to 2 other assassinations of very prominent members of American society. The first was the assassination of Elmer Ellsworth, a Union Army colonel who was killed by a hotel owner in Virginia in May of 1868, and the second was a Union Army general named James B. McPherson, who was killed during the Battle of Atlanta in July of 1864. What's cool about this is that it's not actually the weird part. What's weird is that prior to the death of Abraham Lincoln at the hands of John Wilkes Booth, Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was actually saved by John Wilkes Booth's brother, Edwin Booth. Edwin, who was a famous actor at the time, had seen Robert Todd fall between the platform and a train at a train station and quickly pulled him to safety before things got gory. At the time, Edwin had no idea who Robert Todd was, and Robert Todd later recounted the incident, saying, "I was indebted to him for the rest of my life." Pretty strange stuff.
Speaking of Abraham Lincoln, he shares some pretty uncanny similarities with John F. Kennedy. People have listed tons of coincidences between the two, too many to list here, but some of the most famous include Lincoln and Kennedy both being elected to Congress in a year ending in 46. Then both were elected president in a year ending in 60. They both had security agents named William, who died at the age of 75. The eeriest similarities surround their deaths, though. Both presidents died after being fired at in the head on a Friday, and both were sitting next to their wives at the time. Lincoln died at Ford's Theater, and Kennedy died in a Lincoln car, which was made by the Ford Motor Company. Both had been accompanied by another couple, the male in each couple being wounded in the attack as well. And both of their successors were named Johnson. Lincoln was succeeded by Andrew Johnson, and Kennedy was succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson. Lastly, the names Lincoln and Kennedy each have 7 letters. That's not a big one, but there's tons of others. Just read about it, it's nuts.
Next on our list, we have the striking life of Walter Summerford, and when I say striking, I mean it. Summerford was a British officer and a major in the British Army during World War I, who was struck by lightning 4 separate times on 4 separate occasions, 3 times when he was alive. The first time Summerford was struck was on the battlefield in 1981, after which he was paralyzed from the waist down. But luckily for him, after his retirement, he was rehabilitated, and after a while, he regained the ability to walk. Unluckily for him, just 6 years later, he was struck by lightning for a second time, and he became paralyzed on the right side of his body. Again, in time, he was able to regain the ability to walk and lived a normal life. Up until 1930, that is, when he was struck by lightning for a 3rd time while trying to walk through a park in Vancouver. This time he was paralyzed completely, and he remained bedridden until his death just 2 years later. He was laid to rest in a cemetery and given a gravestone that read, "In loving memory," although it's pretty hard to make it out now considering the fact that shortly after his burial, his gravestone was struck by lightning and split into 3 distinct pieces, one for each time he he was struck while alive. Pretty strange coincidence.
Edgar Allan Poe is legendary when it comes to his fantastical tales of the dark and macabre, but in this case, truth was stranger than fiction because it was eerily close to a fictional work. In 1838, Poe wrote a novel called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. It's about a young man named Arthur Pym who goes on a sea voyage. In one part of the story, though, the crew of Pym's ship finds themselves in a desperate situation. They're stranded without food, so they decide to draw straws to see who will be sacrificed so the others can survive. The unlucky one is the cabin boy named Richard Parker, who ends up being killed and eaten by the others. About 46 years later, in 1884, a real-life ship sank, and their survivors were stranded at sea, and just like in Poe's novel, the men found themselves without food and decided to draw straws to see who would be sacrificed. And who was chosen? It was a young sailor named Richard Parker. Need I say more?
Number 5. Eugene the Mummy. An African-American man in his mid to late 40s was found dead from natural charges on a road near Sabina in Ohio. He was alone and without identification, believed to be a wanderer in search of a job. Townspeople claimed to have seen him walking in town the day before, appearing to be ill. The only things in his pocket were $1.40 and a slip of paper with the address 1118 Yale Avenue, Cincinnati. Upon investigation, authorities arrived at the address only to find a vacant lot. The identity of the man was still a complete mystery, so they decided that the name of a nearby neighbor, Eugene, would work for the time being, at least until they figured out who he was. This man, now named Eugene, was brought to Sabina's Littleton funeral home and embalmed. They then set the mummified man in a brick shed near a bus stop so that people could come by and identify the body. Now, the typical 30-day period of viewing passed with no luck, but pretty soon though, Eugene became a permanent resident of Sabina. He just sat there on the side of the road for years. Now, the town loved what they called their town mascot, and Eugene had a couch to rest on, was dusted and cleaned, and his clothes were changed when they got dingy. Over a period of 35 years, it is estimated that Sabina's mummy man was viewed by 1.5 million people, but he's still never been identified. Now, I'm sorry, I can't believe they were able to do that. That is sick. Number 4. Moonville Tunnel. Located deep in the woods, the Moonville Tunnel is framed by faded stone archways covered in moss. Now, the tunnel itself is long and extremely dark, and it's actually an out-of-work stretch of railroad track that leads to an old coal mining town, and of course, it's haunted. Now, the most infamous Moonville ghost story originated in 1880 when engineer Theodore Lawhead was driving a train down the dark, desolate tracks from Cincinnati to Moretta when another train unexpectedly collided with his. This was apparently a train dispatcher's mistake, and Theodore and a fireman died instantly. As early as 1895, ghost stories about a figure thought to be Theodore, holding a bright white lantern with a flowing white beard, eyes that glistened like balls of fire, and a halo of twinkling stars, would appear and just as quickly disappear. In addition to the engineer, Moonville is supposedly haunted by a railway brakeman who looms in the tunnel, a woman who smells like lavender, and a bully named Baldy Keaton who has been known to throw rocks and tease people. Number 3. Beaver Creek State Park. This park is special because of its history of being a canal system in the 1800s with locks that still remain in the park. One of them, called Jake's Lock, is said to be haunted by Jake, a canal worker who was struck by lightning while walking across the top. Many other legends exist within the park, including the tale of Esther Hale, known as the Bride of the Bridge. On the morning of her wedding, someone was sent to check on the groom to find that his house was empty and he was never seen again. Esther, grieving for months, wondering what happened to her soon-to-be husband, was then found dead in her home. According to the book Haunted Ohio II, it's said by the locals that you can still see her dressed in white, looking for her bridegroom on the bridge over Beaver Creek. She waits there every year on August 12th, a hideous figure in tattered white satin and lace, and if she touches you, she will become young and beautiful again, but you will die. Number 2. Malabar Farm. Malabar Farm was built in 1939 by Pulitzer Prize winning author Louis Broomfield, and it was his home until his death in 1950 1956. But before it was built, another family lived there in the 19th century. Celie Rose, who lived there, was said to be half child and half woman, according to an 1896 newspaper article. Now, she was infatuated with a boy named Guy Barry who lived in a neighboring farmhouse. They saw each other every day, but her parents told her to stay away from him. Now she didn't like that and got angry at them, so she mixed rat poison in their porridge. Her father and brother died, but her mother survived. She was found not guilty by reason of insanity and went to live with her mother. Celie then poisoned her again, and this time it worked. At age 23, Celie stood trial, truly alone, but was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to a state hospital. She lived out the rest of her life at an insane asylum, and since then the house has been haunted. One visitor saw a woman dressed like Celie Rose outside the house. People have seen lights flicker, felt a phantom cat, disembodied voices are heard, and there's an overall eerie feeling on the property. And coming in at number 1 is the Franklin Castle. The Franklin Castle is arguably the most haunted house in Ohio due to the Tiedeman's family's tragic past. Hans Tiedemann, a German immigrant and co-founder of Union Banking and Savings Co., built the home in 1881. His first wife, Louisa, died inside Franklin Castle in the 1890s, and he would eventually bury 3 more of his children and his mother. Since then, the location has been the site of mysterious hauntings. A family with 6 children called the Romanos had moved into the house, and on the day they moved in, 2 of their children said they'd encouraged a crying girl while on the 3rd floor. Now, they kept having a bunch of paranormal experiences, and a priest advised the Romanos to move out, and in 1974 they did. But the hauntings didn't stop when the Romanos left. From there, the house was sold again and again and again. Each new occupant reported strange occurrences like passing through odd vapors, hearing a child crying, or seeing a woman in black standing in the window.
The connection between Sir Anthony Hopkins and the girl from Petrovka is a story that feels like it was just lifted straight out of the movie itself. While preparing for his role in the film adaptation of the novel, Hopkins was eager to read the book to get a better understanding of his character, a real professional. However, despite searching everywhere, he couldn't find a copy. Then, in a very weird twist of fate, he stumbled upon a copy left on a random park bench, as if the universe had placed it there just for him. The story gets even stranger when Hopkins later met the book's author. During their conversation, the author mentioned that he had lent his last copy of the book to a friend who had unfortunately lost it on a park bench. The chances of Hopkins finding that very copy are so slim that it has to be a glitch in reality where the lines between coincidence and destiny blur. It just makes us wonder, is there some unseen force that was at play just ensuring that Hopkins got his hands on this very elusive book? I don't know, it's just too strange. I can't explain it, it freaks me out. The strange life of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette is filled with many twists and turns, but one particular coincidence stands out as almost too eerie to ignore. On June 21st, 1791, the royal couple was arrested while attempting to escape from France during the height of the French Revolution, a moment that marked the beginning of their tragic downfall. However, what makes this event even more uncanny is a seemingly innocent diary entry made by Louis XVI exactly 18 years earlier. On that same day, June 21st, Louis wrote that he hoped never to undertake a journey on that day again, as if he had some premonition of what the future held. Fast forward almost 2 decades, and the date he had hoped to avoid became the very day his fate was sealed. This peculiar coincidence adds a mysterious layer to their story, making me wonder if this was more than just a quirk of history, perhaps a glitch in reality, where destiny and foresight collided in an unforgettable way. The mysterious case of Joseph Figlock is a story that almost defies belief. In 1950, Figlock, an ordinary man in Detroit, was walking down the street when out of nowhere, a baby fell from a high window and landed directly on him. Both he and the baby survived the frightening incident, okay, don't freak out, with Figlock's presence likely having saved the child's life. As if this wasn't bizarre enough, a year later, Figlock found himself in an almost identical situation. Once again, he was walking the same street and another baby fell from the exact same window and landed on him. Incredibly, both he and the baby survived this second fall as well. The odds of such an event happening once are super low, but twice? It's the kind of coincidence that makes you wonder if reality just glitched. You know, we're back in the loop, we're back in Groundhog's Day. At least this one has a happy ending though, you know? That's something I can get behind. Edgar Allan Poe's novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, written in 1838, tells the haunting tale of a shipwreck where the desperate survivors, driven to the brink, resort to consuming one of their own, ultimately sacrificing a cabin boy named Richard Parker. As eerie as this fictional story is, reality took a chilling turn nearly 50 years later when, in 1884, a real shipwreck unfolded under strikingly similar circumstances. The survivors, stranded and starving, made the harrowing decision to kill and consume one of their own to stay alive. In a twist that seems almost too bizarre to be true, the unfortunate victim was also a cabin boy, and his name was Richard Parker. The uncanny resemblance between Poe's dark fiction and the grim reality that followed has led many to wonder if this was more than just a coincidence. Honestly, I myself, since I heard this story a few years ago, have been convinced that Edgar Allan Poe's a time traveler. I don't know, that seems more logical than anything else, which is crazy to say. The case of the Carol A. Deering is one of those maritime mysteries that continues to baffle and intrigue, and if you've been a fan of this channel for a while, you've definitely heard the story of the Carol A. Deering before. In 1921, the Carol A. Deering, a commercial schooner, was found mysteriously aground off the coast of North Carolina, with its crew having vanished without a trace. The ship was in good condition, the food was laid out as if the crew had simply just stepped away, yet there was no sign of the men anywhere. What makes this case even stranger is that another ship, the SS Hewitt, disappeared around the same time and in the same general area, adding to the sense that something otherworldly might have been at play. These two eerie events happening so close together have fueled theories of mysterious phenomenon. Whether it was a Bermuda Triangle type scenario or an interdimensional glitch or I don't know, something else entirely, the Carol A. Deering remains a haunting reminder that some corners of history might just be too strange to fully understand, leaving us to wonder if these events were part of a reality that momentarily went off script.
Next up, we have nukes on the moon with Project A-11-9. So this was a secret plan developed by the United States Air Force in 1958 during the Cold War. A lot of weird stuff going on in the Cold War. The idea behind this was to detonate a nuclear on the moon. Now, you're probably wondering why anyone would want to do something like this. There were a couple reasons. The main goal here really was to demonstrate the military and technological might of the United States to the Soviet Union, who at the time were making big strides in the space race. It was basically just incredibly petty, but scientists were also curious about what would happen if a nuclear bomb exploded on the moon, I guess. They wanted to study things like the impact it would have on the surface and whether it would create any detectable effects from Earth, but the project never actually happened. It was eventually scrapped because of concerns about the potential negative consequences. People were worried about the environmental impact of detonating a nuclear space, as well as the potential political fallout. On top of all that though, this just would have been a total waste of time.
Next up, we have the My Lai killings, which took place on March 6 of 1968. On that day, the American military killed around 576 South Vietnamese civilians, including some of the most vulnerable members of the community, who had absolutely nothing to do with the ongoing conflict at the time. When the public learned about the atrocity, which was broadcasted in 1969 on major news networks who shared graphic images of the incident, they were not happy. The event became a major controversy, with many demanding the perpetrators responsible for ending so many innocent lives be held accountable for their actions. Platoon Commander Lieutenant William Calley Jr. was given a life sentence, but it didn't stick. At the order of President Nixon, Cali was instead placed on house arrest and then released just 3.5 years later. 26 soldiers were charged in military court, but none were convicted. The war continued until 1975 and resulted in an estimated total of 1.4 million civilian casualties in southern Vietnam.
This next one sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it isn't. Operation Northwoods. So this was a plan devised by the US Department of Defense in 1962. The basic idea was to carry out a series of deceptive and covert operations to create a justification for the United States to invade Cuba. Cuba was seen as a potential threat at the time because it had close ties with the Soviet Union. The US government was worried about communism spreading in the West, and Cuba was seen as a potential domino that could fall. So, Operation Northwoods proposed things like staging attacks on US soil and then blaming it on Cuba, hijacking planes and ships, even orchestrating violent incidents in American cities. Like, the goal was to create public outrage and support for military action against Cuba. Crazy. Luckily, this was proposed, but it was rejected by the Kennedy administration. The fact that it was even brought up, though, as a possibility is incredibly disturbing.
Next up, we have the 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill. The incident took place on January 28th of that year. A Union oil rig suffered a major blowout that caused 3 million barrels of oil to spill into 35 miles of the coastline of Santa Barbara, California. The impact of the environment was catastrophic. An estimated 3,500 seabirds were immediately smothered in oil, as well as countless other marine animals. It screwed the ecosystem, the environment, and the economy. And people were pissed, rightfully so. The only good thing about the incident was that it led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is an independent agency of the United States government tasked with environmental protection matters and efforts. But surprise, surprise, attempts to undermine the agency have been successful, and that is why we have offshore oil drilling, one of the largest contributors to oceanic environmental issues to date, other than pollution, litter. You guys know what I mean.
Operation Mockingbird was a covert operation carried out by the CIA during the Cold War. The goal of this operation was to influence and manipulate media outlets, both domestically and internationally, trying to spin things to promote certain narratives and agendas. Operation Mockingbird was involved in stuff like planting stories, manipulating news content, even recruiting journalists to act as CIA assets. The idea was to ensure that the info reaching the public aligned with the government's objective and promoting anti-communist sentiment. Now, a lot of what Operation Mockingbird did is still kinda murky, but details have come to light over time through declassified documents and investigative journalism. Now, apparently, even some journalists at the time were spied on, having their phones tapped and stuff as well.
And to finish us off, we have the highly unethical detonation of the world's first atomic explosive, Trinity, which was an exact replica of Fat Man, the explosive device that devastated Nagasaki on August 9th of 1945. And Trinity was detonated just 15 miles away from commercial farms as well as residential homes. Oh, and they didn't warn anyone or evacuate anyone in that surrounding area. So in New Mexico on July 16th of 1945, less than just 1 month prior to the events in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they went ahead and detonated the highly unstable and incredibly under-researched explosive, exposing those living nearby to over 10,000 times the recommended levels of radiation. And some of the radiation even reached all the way to Indiana, which is like 5 states over, which is crazy, which is why this incident ended up on this list. The Superior Universal Alignment cult was founded by Valentina de Andrade in the late 1900s. Among the members of the cult were Valentina de Andrade herself, 2 doctors, 2 former police officers, and the son of a very powerful businessman. The cult's main goal? Mutilation and ritualistic killing. You see, the members of the Superior Universal Alignment cult, for whatever reason, reason, believe that men born after 1981 were possessed by the devil. Why did they think this? I have literally no idea, but what I do know is that the organization routinely and ritualistically took young men against their will and removed their eyes and reproductive organs before ending their lives in the name of the Lord. In total, the organization caused the deaths of at least 6 young men and severely injured at least 3 more. While many members of the organization were initially arrested in the 1990s, on September 12th of 1995, they were all set free. No justice in the judicial system, I guess.
The Unification Church, a religious movement which combines elements of Christianity, shamanism, Confucianism, all with a strong anti-communist stance. The group was founded by Sun Myung Moon in South Korea during the 60s. They are often referred to as the Moonies, and their rituals involve really creepy mass wedding ceremonies. Sun Myung Moon claimed he was chosen by Jesus to complete a divine mission here on Earth. According to Moon, Jesus had started a sacred task, but it was left unfinished, so Moon believed it was his job to wrap things up. And he had a rather unusual plan to do so by creating pure families through mass weddings. Moon started organizing these massive wedding ceremonies where complete strangers would marry each other. He actually set a Guinness World Record by marrying 6,500 strangers in one single event. After getting married, these new couples were then expected to sell their stuff and hand over all the proceeds to Moon. You know, just to make sure everyone was devoted to the church and his mission and not worldly possessions.
While I do not know the name of this next cult, it was brought to the attention of the masses by someone who most of you should know the name of, Angelina Jolie. While Jolie never outright said the name of the cult, she was captured on film speaking about it with a group of friends back in 1999. She described it as a Hollywood cult for celebrities, with the main aspect of the organization being the initiation ritual that seemed to draw inspiration from sadism and masochism practices. Jolie told of how new members of the cult were tied up, tormented, and violated against their will. Angelina Jolie recounted her time partaking in the ritual, saying that after it was completed, she was also forced to kill a snake. There really isn't much else out there about the cult, no information on other members, or whether or not the cult really does exist, but it's Hollywood, so, you know, it probably does.
The Order of the Nine Angels, or ONA for short. For some background, the Order of the Nine Angels was established in the United Kingdom back in the 60s, but only came to public attention in the 80s. They started getting a lot of negative attention for their racist ideologies. The cult describes its approach as traditional Satanism, but it also pulls inspiration from ancient Greek and Egyptian mythology and certain elements of modern paganism. But none of those practices they've taken inspiration from are even half as gruesome as the practices of the ONA. The majority of rituals performed by this particular cult were done so inside of stone circles during solstices and equinoxes. The rituals were considered ceremonial by the cult and downright debaucherous by everyone else. Everyone who had at least some sense. The cult's main ritualistic practice was killing, and one of the worst killings took place in 2008, when members of the cult consumed the hearts and tongues of their victims in an effort to become closer to Satan. Luckily, the members of the cult were eventually arrested, but only one member received a sentence of 20 years. The rest served 8 to 10-year sentences or were sent to mental institutions. To make matters even worse, the one member to receive 20 years was pardoned in 2023, which is absolutely insane because due to guidelines, I wasn't even able to tell half of the terrible things this cult did. So just take my word for it, these guys got off way too easy.
And then there's Matamoros, a cult rooted in 2 main ideologies: human sacrifice and illicit substance dealing. The organization was infiltrated by police in 1989 when authorities found the bodies of 12 men buried on a ranch in Mexico near the US border and 3 more bodies at another location. When members of the Matamoros cult were arrested in relation to the deaths, they claimed that they had not killed anyone, but rather sacrificed many in order to protect their substance smuggling operation. As the police dove further into the Matamoros organization, they realized that it was in fact Far more than a substance dealing ring, it was also a satanic cult led by Adolfo de Jesus Constanzo and Sarah Aldrete, who was referred to by many of her disciples as simply the witch. When the pair learned that their organization had been infiltrated by authorities, they fled with a few of their followers. While on the run, Constanzo instructed one of his followers to kill him and then kill himself. When police finally caught up to the group, Constanzo along with one of his disciples were already dead, and Aldrete, aka the witch, was arrested and sentenced to 62 years in prison for her crimes.
Mostly because today Oxford is still very much around. New students arrive every year, while the Aztec Empire feels again like this long lost age where there are only these mysterious, esoteric remnants left behind. Just weird to think about. You'd probably think anyone directly associated with the Civil War died a long time ago, but that is not the case with Helen Viola Jackson. She was born in 1916 and was the last surviving widow of a Civil War veteran. And when did she die? 4 years ago. She died in 2020 at the age of 101. Helen was just a young girl during the Great Depression when she met James Bolin, a much older man who had fought for the Union in the Civil War. And by older, I mean crazy older. Helen was 17, Bolin was 93. They got married. Don't worry though, it's not as icky as it sounds. This was a purely practical marriage. Helen's family was struggling and Bolin didn't want to go into a home. He asked Helen to marry him so she could have his military pension after he passed away. It was a mutually beneficial thing and actually happened more than you'd probably think. They cared about each other, sure, but not in that way. At least I don't think. I hope not. Helen never talked much about the marriage. She kept it a secret for a lot of years because she was just worried about what other people would think, and I mean, fair enough. It wasn't until she was much older that she started sharing her story, revealing a personal connection to a war that ended over 150 years before she died. Mike the Headless Chicken. It sounds like the title of an adult comedy cartoon, but this is a true story. There should absolutely be a movie based on this though. Our story begins in 1945 in Colorado. A farmer named Lloyd Olson decides it's time to make some dinner, so he goes out to the yard to chop off the head of one of his chickens. Lloyd brings the axe down on a 5.5-month-old rooster named Mike, but instead of dropping dead like a normal chicken when its head is lobbed off, Mike just shakes it off and struts around like nothing happened. Lloyd's standing there probably thinking he's lost his mind, but Mike is just wandering around, bumping into things, of course, but mostly acting like a regular chicken. Turns out Lloyd had done some sloppy work and had missed the jugular vein, leaving one ear and most of Mike's brain stem intact. Instead of finishing the job though, Lloyd saw a golden opportunity. You see, there's a valuable lesson in this story, folks. Sometimes your biggest success can come from one simple mistake, like not chopping off a head properly in this instance. Lloyd starts feeding and watering Mike directly into his esophagus with a dropper, and Mike just kept on living day after day, week after week, and then word gets around, and soon enough Mike is a national sensation. Newspapers dub him Mike the Headless Chicken, and he goes on tour, making Lloyd a tidy little profit, and people pay good money to see the Headless Wonder. And Mike even lands a spot in Life magazine. He was living the high life. Mike became a legend in just 18 months, but sadly, the parties, the late nights, the fame, it was too much to handle, and he eventually choked on a kernel of corn. Finally, we have a very weird story from ancient Greece. Sounds more like something from an early 2000s gross-out comedy rather than an actual story from history. The 6th century BC philosopher Heraclitus was a major influence on philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Unfortunately for Heraclitus though, his legacy will always be stained by his bizarre and rather revolting death. That's putting it very lightly. He suffered from, at the time, what was called dropsy, where fluid accumulates in the body. And Heraclitus tried to get help from physicians at first, but he wasn't really convinced of their conventional treatments. So instead he covered himself in cow dung, which, I mean, that's an alternative. That's one way of going about it. His idea was that the heat generated from the dung would somehow help evaporate all the excess fluid in his body, but of course this did not work. There's some debate as to whether he just died of his condition, covered in excrement, or if things got even worse. Some versions of the story go that he met an even more grisly fate, becoming trapped in the dung, either because it dried up or because it acted a bit like quicksand, and when he tried to call out for help, a gang of rabid dogs rushed over and devoured him, which would not have been a very tasty meal. Napoleon eventually had to flee to his carriage, but the rabbits kept following him, some even jumping into the carriage. It wasn't until they finally rolled away that the rabbit onslaught finally ended. I'm going to tell you about a man named Bobby Leach. Leach was born in Lancaster, England in 1858. He was a daredevil, performing insane stunts like going over Niagara Falls in a barrel, and living to tell the tale. He'd also worked as a circus stunt performer before becoming a restaurant owner. Even into his 60s, he was doing stuff like attempting to swim the Whirlpool Rapids in Niagara River. He failed several times, but this actually isn't how he died. For everything this crazy man had survived, it ended up being an orange peel that did him in. Leach was on a publicity tour in New Zealand, where he slipped on an orange peel. He ended up injuring his leg, which became infected. He ended up getting gangrene, and his leg needed to be amputated, and he died about 2 months later from complications. Next up on the list, we have the killer beard, and I don't mean like, dude, killer beard. I mean, this beard actually killed the man sporting it. The man in question was named Hans Steininger. Hans Steininger was born in 1508 and grew up to be well known in Austria. Not only did he become the mayor of his town, but he also had an incredibly long beard, measuring about 4.5 feet. Now, normally Steininger kept his beard neatly rolled up and tucked into a leather pouch to keep it out of the way, but one day in 1567, there was a big fire in the town, causing chaos and panic amongst the people. So in the midst of all this commotion, Steininger either forgot to secure his beard or it came loose, and as he hurried down the stairs, he stepped on his own beard, tripped and fell, breaking his neck. If you think the length of his beard has just been exaggerated over the years, well, you can actually see it for yourself. His beard was cut off and preserved, and it's now housed at the museum in the Austrian town where he's from. Draco, an ancient Athenian lawgiver, died in one of the worst ways. No, he wasn't set on fire, he didn't drown or endure days of grueling sadistic torment. Instead, he died being smothered in a bunch of men's sweaty clothing. Draco is known for creating a very harsh legal code, which is why the term draconian is used today to describe severe laws or rules. Draco was presenting his new policies to a crowd of wealthy Greeks one day, and these policies were incredibly strict, but for some reason the crowd was just thrilled with this guy, and their excitement turned into a chaotic celebration. In their enthusiasm, the people started taking their clothes off and throwing them at him, as people are known to do. They tossed their hats, tunics, whatever else they were wearing, which wasn't much back then, so they were now just naked. But then Draco, I guess, would have lost his balance. Everyone probably laughed and kept cheering and hurling more and more tunics on him, and Draco probably found it funny too, until he would have realized he wasn't able to move anymore or breathe. The sheer volume of tunics that were raining down on him ended up smothering him. He was buried under a mountain of garments and suffocated to death. The bear soldier. In 1942, Polish soldiers stationed in Iran encountered a young bear cub. An Iranian boy had found the cub after its mother was killed by hunters. The soldiers, part of the Polish Second Corps, decided to adopt the bear and named him Wojtek. Wojtek quickly became a beloved member of the unit. He ate with the soldiers, he'd train with them, he'd salute when he was greeted. He really liked drinking and smoking cigarettes as well. As the Polish unit prepared to join the Allied forces in Italy, though, they faced a bit of a problem. Military regulations didn't allow animals to accompany soldiers. So what did they do? Did they leave him behind? No, instead they officially enlisted Wojtek as a private in the Polish army, complete with his own paybook, rank, serial number. Wojtek would actually help out too. He'd move heavy crates of ammunition, mimicking the soldiers by standing on his hind legs and carrying boxes. After the war, Wojtek traveled with the soldiers to Scotland, where he lived at the Edinburgh Zoo until his death in 1963. Alright, Robert Liston may have been a fast surgeon, but he's probably remembered as one of the worst after an absolutely disastrous surgery led to the death of 3 people, only one of them actually being a patient. Robert Liston was a British surgeon in the 1800s. He was working at a time where there were no anesthetics, so surgeries needed to be performed fast. Now, for one, the patients would be in incredible pain, but they could also die from shock, so, in all fairness to him, time was always of the essence, but my god, he really messed up in this one procedure. He was amputating a patient's leg, but in his haste, he accidentally cut off 2 of his own assistant's fingers. The assistant later died of gangrene. Liston also accidentally swiped at a fellow doctor, cutting into his coat, and the elderly doctor, thinking he'd been now cut open, caught such a fright that he suffered a heart attack and died. And finally, the patient the guy was operating on also got gangrene and died soon after the procedure. Many countries are known for wars and great battles fought throughout history, and Australia is no exception. But what war took place in Australia, and who was it against? Well, Australia wasn't in battle with another country here. They weren't even in a war with human beings. They were fighting a battle against the mighty creatures known as emus. The Emu War took place in Australia in 1932. So after World War I, many Australian soldiers were given land in Western Australia to farm as a reward for their service, but because of economic difficulties, these farmers were facing some tough times. To make matters worse, huge flocks of emus began migrating through their farmland. The emus caused a lot of damage to crops. The farmers were desperate, and desperate times call for a bunch of emus to be blown straight to hell. So the farmers asked the government for help. In response, the government decided to send soldiers to reduce the emu population by wasting them. The war began in November of 32, but it quickly became clear it wasn't going to be easy. The emus proved to be surprisingly difficult to target. They were fast, agile. They had a knack for dispersing into smaller groups. Over the course of a few weeks, they only managed to kill a small number of emus compared to the vast numbers roaming the farmland. And after realizing that the effort was going to be ineffective, the government decided to withdraw their troops. The emus survived the war with minimal casualties, and the campaign was ultimately deemed a failure.
At number 5 is the tapeworm diet. Oh boy. Back in the early 20th century, some folks believed that having a tapeworm was the ultimate weight loss solution. The idea was that this unwelcome guest would munch away at your ingested goodies, leaving you slimmer without really cutting back on the snacks. But of course, reality rarely agrees with such bizarre notions. This diet often led to some malnutrition on account of the fact that you have a literal worm in your intestines absorbing all your nutrients for you. There's also the possibility of infection on account of the fact that you have a literal worm in your intestines pooping as it pleases, as well as a whole breadth of seriously unpleasant side effects. On account of the fact that you have a literal worm inside of your intestines, I mean, come on you guys, is it that hard to see why this is a problem? Not to mention that once you invited these freeloaders into your gut, getting them out is a whole new ordeal. So while tapping into a tapeworm might sound like the stuff of science fiction, it's a reminder that even in the pursuit of health and beauty, a little freaking common sense goes a long way. At number 4, the Roman times, the land of togas, gladiators, and ingesting urine? Oh god, it just keeps getting worse. The ancient Romans were known for their ingenuity, but they also had some rather peculiar medical practices hanging up their tunics. Pun not intended. Now don't be weird or anything, they weren't just consuming any urine. Only urine of certain individuals were said to hold magical healing properties. This practice, known as urotherapy, involved applying urine to wounds, gargling it for oral health care and teeth whitening, and using it as an ingredient in various remedies. Now before you wrinkle your nose in disbelief, let's delve into the logic, or lack thereof. Romans believed that urine carried the secrets to a person's health. They would examine its color, taste, and even smell to diagnose illnesses. They had specific urinals for the purpose, designed to catch the precious liquid and let doctors perform their analysis with the seriousness of a modern day lab technician. But wait, it gets even weirder. Some Romans took this to a whole new level. See, Emperor Nero, for instance, reportedly used young boys' urine to keep his skin looking radiant. And if that wasn't enough, they even had manuals, yes, actual books on the art of uroscopy, the skill of reading pee like it's some kind of mystical scroll. So the next time you raise an eyebrow to modern medicine, just remember, at least we're not doing that. The ancient Romans may have left us with some impressive architecture, but their medical advice? Oh boy. At number 3 is morphine. In the late 1800s, a new wonder drug emerged, morphine. Physicians hailed it as a magic wand against pain, disease, and discomfort. But here's the catch. While it might have provided temporary relief, it was far from a magic cure. Opium, as you may know, is highly addictive and can have some rather unpleasant side effects. So what began as a medical miracle turned into a nationwide nightmare. By 1895, the opiate addiction had gripped 1 in 200 Americans. The Civil War inadvertently launched an opiate epidemic, with the hypodermic syringe becoming a go-to temptation for both doctors and patients alike. The addiction crisis peaked in 1895, prompting a slow reversal. Advances in medicine, education, and regulation began to unshackle society from the opiate grip. Opium dens and smoking emerged, changing societal perceptions in the face of addiction. Laws evolved from regulation to prohibition to treatment, and the allure of quick relief reminds us to tread carefully. At number 2, a practice that might just leave you scratching your head, trepanation, the ancient technique of drilling a hole into the skull. Now, before you wince too hard, let's explore why people would actually voluntarily undergo this procedure. Back in the day, trepanation was believed to treat a variety of ailments, from headaches to epilepsy to, well, letting out demons. Think of it as the let's let the bad stuff out approach to medicine, kind of like installing a pressure valve for your brain, but with more drilling and less engineering. Ancient civilizations like the Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Incas all had their take on this practice. They used a range of tools from flint to bronze to carefully bore holes into the noggin. But the question remains, did it work? Well, evidence suggests that some people actually survived this procedure, with archaeological finds showing evidence of healed skull openings, which is pretty impressive considering the tools and, lack of modern medicine or any anesthesia whatsoever. But let's not kid ourselves, this was still a risky game of chance. But before you grab your drill and start, thinking of a career change, let's remember that trepanation's scientific validity is, well, a bit holy. Like, these jeans should be 50% off holy, not sew those jeans up before you're late for church holy, just to clarify. At number 1 is maggot therapy, the worst one. Maggot therapy, also known as larval therapy, was a rather unconventional method used in the past for treating various ailments. Back in the day, doctors would intentionally introduce maggots onto wounds. Why, you ask? Well, as it turns out, these creepy crawlies had a peculiar talent. Maggots have an appetite for dead tissue. They munch away on the necrotic, infected parts of a wound, leaving the healthy tissue untouched. Kind of like a tiny cleanup crew crawling on your skin. The practice might seem bizarre to us now, but it had a surprisingly practical rationale. History records suggest that maggot therapy dates back to ancient times, with reports of its use in cultures like the Mayans and the Aboriginal peoples of Australia. However, it gained even more popularity during the 19th century, especially during times of war when infections and gangrene were rampant. But here's the twist. Maggot therapy has actually found a place in modern medicine too. In controlled and sterile environments, medical maggots are bred and used to actually clean wounds, promote healing, and prevent infections. These maggots are certified clean, not the ones you'd find in your backyards. So there you have it. Maggot therapy might give you the heebie-jeebies, but it's a prime example of how unconventional methods can sometimes lead to surprisingly medical breakthroughs. However, personally, I'd rather just perish.
Number 5, the headless chicken. This whole incident began in 1945 in Colorado. A farmer named Lloyd Olson tried to lob off the head of one of his chickens because it was time for dinner and his wife was going to prepare a meal for his mother-in-law. Most of the head came off, but he missed the jugular and most of its brainstem was still intact. He attempted to prep the chicken for dinner, but was still alive. So instead of trying again, he decided to just take care of it. He used an eyedropper to give it water and would feed it small bits of corn and grains. But this day would change the course of both the Olsen family and the chicken forever, as this headless bird would soon skyrocket to fame, becoming known as Mike the headless chicken. Together they toured the US, with Mike being showcased in freak shows and circus sideshows, which I think are pretty much the same thing. He was photographed for magazines. Everyone wanted to meet Mike the headless chicken. Chicks wanted his autograph. He was a sensation for 18 whole months before finally dying in 1947. The blood eagle. So this was a form of punishment carried out by Vikings, and it's pretty brutal. The blood eagle was a practice used on particularly bad enemies, traitors, or those who were deemed dishonorable. The recipient of this lovely procedure was restrained, laying face down on the ground. On their back, they would have the image of an eagle with its wings spread out, carved into them. Then the victim's ribs were separated from the spine and kind of splayed out, so in the end they'd almost have this appearance of wings coming out of their back. And finally the lungs would be pulled out and like splayed over the ribs, which would kind of flutter in the wind like the wings of a majestic eagle. What a cool party trick. Sounds like a fun time to be alive. Next on the list we have the tapeworm diet. This was a bizarre weight loss method popular in the early 20th century, which involved intentionally ingesting a tapeworm in the hopes of shedding weight. Advertisements claimed that the tapeworms would consume a portion of the food in the digestive tract, leading to weight loss without altering one's eating habits. Some people looking to lose weight could purchase tapeworm cysts, usually in the form of a pill from dubious sources. Once ingested, the tapeworms would grow and absorb nutrients from the host's food. As they matured, the tapeworms would reach several feet in length. Weight loss was just a side effect of malnutrition, and the body's struggle to absorb nutrients effectively due to, having a tapeworm in their stomach. This was obviously incredibly dangerous. There were complications, including abdominal pain and worse stuff. In some cases, of course, life-threatening conditions if the parasites migrated to other parts of the body especially. And the tapeworms couldn't really be controlled or selectively removed once inside the body. And eventually, medical professionals stepped in and began to denounce the tapeworm diet as very risky and ineffective, and eventually the sale of tapeworm products started to decline, thankfully. Number 2, buried alive. Now, this is one a lot of you may know about already, but people used to get buried alive a lot, and not always on purpose. This macabre occurrence stemmed from a lack of medical understanding and limited technology. The 18th century saw especially a rise in cases of mistaken death due to various factors, like certain illnesses, accidents, comas especially. Medical professionals of the era really struggled to accurately determine whether someone was actually dead or not, leading to premature burials. Graveyards became the unintended scenes of horror, as unfortunate folks were laid to rest before they were actually dead. The fear of being buried alive was a very real concern in society at that time, which led to the invention of various safety measures to prevent people from dying in their graves, which is an odd sentence to say. Some coffins were fitted with bells or strings attached to the deceased's finger, which would be pulled from above ground in case they woke up. Then hopefully a gravedigger would hear the bell and race over to dig the person out. And coming in at number 1, we have mummy medicine. Mummy medicine was practiced for hundreds of years and involved using ground up mummy remains in medical remedies. European apothecaries believed that powdered mummy could cure various ailments due to its perceived mystical and restorative properties. The main source of these mummies was, of course, Egypt, where preserved corpses were plentiful due to natural dehydration in the dry climate. Mummies were ground into powder and added to medical concoctions believed to treat conditions ranging from epilepsy, stomach disorders, and the demand for mummies was so high that sometimes led to the deliberate plundering of ancient Egyptian tombs. And despite this widespread use, mummy medicine lacked any real scientific basis, and over time, as medical understanding improved, the practice fell out of favor.
In 2021, a trail of fossilized footprints changed historians' entire understanding of the timeline of human migration. The footprints were discovered in what was once, around 23,000 years ago, a salt lake and what is now the Tularosa Basin in New Mexico. It was shocking to say the least, because the discovery meant that humans had arrived in the Americas up to 10,000 years before what was previously thought, meaning that they would have interacted with ice-aged animals like mammoths and saber-toothed tigers, saber-toothed tigers being my personal favorite extinct animal. The fossilized footprints disappear and reappear annually with the shifting sands of the basin, so they are not always available for viewing, unfortunately. But if you would like, you can see an exact replica of the groundbreaking discovery at the Tularosa Visitors Center.
In central China, archaeologists discovered stone tools that changed what they previously thought about early human migration. The tools, found at a site called Shangshen, are about 2 million years old, a lot earlier than the previously oldest known tools found in Eurasia, which were around 1.85 million years old. Between 2004 and 2017, a team of geologists dug into a slope in central China. They found 96 stone tools in different layers of sediment. The tools were left just where they had been used, making it kind of easy for them to date them accurately. The tools included sharp-edged flakes for cutting and chunks of rock that had been used to make them. Before this find, the oldest known human fossils outside of Africa were found at a site in Georgia, dating back from between 1.85 and 1.77 million years ago. The tools at Shangshen are about 250,000 years older than that, meaning that clearly humans left Africa and reached central China much earlier than we thought before.
For so long, we have viewed Neanderthals as brutish, barbaric, and kind of unintelligent, but a recent discovery in Spain has led historians to believe that there might have been much more to our hairy cousin species than previously thought. In 2010, a collection of decorative shells dating back to up to 50,000 years ago were discovered in a cave in southern Spain. The shells had been colored and pierced with holes, likely so that they could be worn as jewelry. What does this discovery tell us? Well, that ancient Neanderthals had the capacity to think symbolically and create intricate works of art, making them much smarter and more in touch with their emotions than ever imagined. Other archaeological finds such as rock art, seafaring technologies, evidence of navigation, long-distance interactions, and ceremonial burials present in the Neanderthal world have also supported this theory. In fact, some people believe that Neanderthals were actually smarter than us, but that we were more ruthless, and that's why we're here today, and they're not.
It seems like Indonesia really may have been the birthplace for visual art. In 2014, scientists found something really surprising in Indonesia, a shell with geometric patterns engraved on it. This shell, discovered on a riverbank, was dated to be at least 430,000 years old. What's amazing is that these patterns aren't even believed to have been created by modern humans at all, but Homo erectus, an ancient human species we never thought had the capacity for artistic expression. Before this find, we didn't think Homo erectus had the ability to create art or think abstractly, and this discovery may have changed that, showing that this proto-human species may have actually had complex cognitive abilities and that art actually predates modern humans. Maybe etching things into rock, or in this case shells, didn't just come about with us. Instead, it seems that even our distant relatives like Homo erectus had the capacity for creativity, which is actually kinda nuts to think about.
Perhaps one of the most important artifacts used to rewrite, or more accurately, properly understand history would be the Rosetta Stone, which is not just a language learning software, but a broken part of a larger stone slab with the same message carved in 3 different types of writing. Before the discovery of the stone, Egyptian hieroglyphics were completely undecipherable. But because of the fact that one of the messages on the stone was written in ancient Greek, and historians knew how to read ancient Greek, scholars were able to decipher the previously illegible Egyptian hieroglyphics and uncover many of the secrets of ancient Egyptian civilizations. The story on the stone told of an ancient royal cult and the first anniversary of the cult ruler's coronation. The translation of the Rosetta Stone led to the translation of all ancient Egyptian texts, including pyramid and coffin inscriptions that describe burial practices and class structures within ancient Egypt. Without it, we would be completely lost when it comes to the who's who and what's what of ancient Egyptian, well, everything.
This next discovery is super recent. News about it just came out in April. So just outside the city of Limoges, researchers from the Institute of Preventive Archaeological Research, or INRAP, found remnants of a Roman-era pool and wall surrounding a natural freshwater spring. What's exciting is that this site might be even older, dating back to the Neolithic period, around 4,500 to 6,000 years ago. The Romans built their structure on top of what was likely a sacred sacred well from ancient times. The site included Roman coins, ceramic fragments, and a ceramic depiction of what looks a bit like Medusa, placed near the water source for protection. The second discovery was about 9 miles southeast of Dijon. INRAP uncovered a site that was likely used by humans from the Neolithic period to the Iron Age. At the center of the site, a mysterious monument with 3 interconnected enclosures. A circular enclosure, a horseshoe-shaped one, and an almost square-shaped one. Nearby, they found a necropolis with 5 circular burial enclosures dating back to the Middle to Late Bronze Age. Inside there, they found artifacts like copper alloy pins, ceramic fragments, and a necklace with around 40 amber beads.
In late 2022, a discovery made in an ancient religious sanctuary near the village of San Cassiano dei Bani in Italy challenged everything historians knew about the relationship between the Etruscan civilization, which dominated ancient Italy, and the Romans. Originally, it was believed that the Etruscan civilization fell to the expanding Roman civilization in the late 14th century BC after being defeated in war, but a horde of 24 Etruscan and Roman statues discovered side by side in the dirt might just be rewriting that story. The statues date between the 2nd century BC and the 1st century AD, and they depict gods and replicas of human organs, and they would have been tossed into what was once the thermal waters of the small village of San Cassiano dei Bani by individuals hoping to rid themselves of their ailments. The mix of the statues shows that the civilizations actually had a close relationship, close enough to pray together and even to share sacred prayer sites. A fascinating discovery connecting 2 civilizations previously believed to have been sworn enemies with limited interactions outside the parameters of war.
Next up at number 5, radiation test subject. In 1999, a man named Hisashi Uchi was a power plant technician, and he became known for being exposed to the highest amount of radiation of any human in history. While working at the Tokamura nuclear power plant, after a lack of safety protocols, improper training, and just an overall pressure to meet deadlines, Uchi and his coworkers made a terrible error. They mistakenly mixed an incorrect measurement of radioactive materials into the wrong tank, and as you've probably figured out, it caused a near fatal burst of gamma rays. Hisashi, who happened to be the closest to the incident, was brutally injured and sent to the hospital. Once he was there, it was discovered he had no more white blood cells, so essentially meaning that he had no remaining immune system. And despite being in intense pain with a rapidly deteriorating condition, doctors kept him alive under the family's request. So for 83 days, Uchi remained alive, being used as a test subject for experimental radiation treatment by the doctors, which, I mean, in their defense was the request of the family, but still, he endured several cardiac arrests, lost all of his skin, and suffered brain damage as well as organ failure. One of the last things Uchi ever said was, quote, "I can't take it anymore, I'm not a guinea pig." And then finally, one more cardiac arrest released him from his torture. Coming in at number 4, Mumia. Most widely practiced between the 12th to the 17th century, although there were a few cases in the 18th century that pop up, Mumia was widely used as a means of medicine in many European countries. Now, if you can't tell by the name, Mumia is creepily just as it sounds, the use of human remains to fix a living person's ailments. It was believed by many of the top physicians at the time that ingesting certain remains prompted the medicinal power of the mummy and could cure things like coagulated blood, pain, coughs, inflammation, cramps, and even heal open wounds. Now, they didn't just sit around eating the carcass directly, instead they would either grind the bones into a powder and drink it from there, or drink an extracted liquid from the embalmed individual. In fact, it was so popular at one point that it's believed the reason there are so few mummies these days is because of the high demand of flesh at the time. Coming in at number 3, James Jameson. One of the heirs to the Jameson whiskey family fortune, Jameson considered himself to be an adventurer of sorts and often traveled to far-off lands, detailing the trips in his diary. In 1888, Jameson decided to head out to explore the Congo, and while there he wrote about and demanded some gruesome things from the locals. So before beginning this expedition, Jameson discovered that the area he was visiting was known to have a population that that participated in the eating of other humans. Apparently, Jameson set out to witness it firsthand, which, I mean, why was that his dream? A little suspicious if you ask me, but I digress. According to Asad Farhan, who was his translator for the trip, Jameson bought a girl from a trader of slaves for a few handkerchiefs and gave her over to the tribe to be. Allegedly, he didn't pay the tribe directly, but in a roundabout way, he did sort of pay to have this girl killed. What's even more gross is that he proceeded to draw and paint watercolors of the gruesome event while it happened, which again, just wrong on so many levels. Coming in at number 2, Cambodian Barbies. You may have been taught about the Khmer Rouge in history class, but if they don't ring a bell, essentially they were an extreme communist regime in Cambodia that held government between 1975 to 1979. They were known for being extremely cruel and committed some of the most horrifying acts of genocide in history, with nearly 2 million perishing under their ruling. Now, during their radical rule, the entire country was isolated from all foreign influences. This included closing schools, hospitals, factories, banks, foreign agriculture. They believed this would stimulate the rebirth of the country, but of course, all it did was send it into desolate famine and poverty. Led by a man named Pol Pot, the people of the country could not forage for food, despite the fact that everyone was starving, and anyone who disobeyed the orders was killed. Apparently, as the people became more and more desperate, they began to turn to folk magic, turning Barbie dolls into smoking talismans for luck. Thankfully, since its dissolution in 1999, all the leaders have been jailed for their atrocities, and the people are freed from the genocidal regime. And last up, in our number 1 spot, the Rabbit Woman. Her name was Mary Toft, and in 1726 she became known throughout Surrey, England as having been the woman who gave birth to rabbits. Now, I know what you're thinking, that isn't possible. And you would be right, but still the story of how she convinced people it was real was crazy. Apparently Toft was actually pregnant at one point, but miscarried, and it could have been this that sent her into her madness. Toft began declaring that she was giving birth to various animal parts, and so her local doctor became involved in the case. At first, everyone actually believed her, as in fact a rabbit did, well, come out of her. And with a doctor backing up her claims, the king and his royal surgeon got involved. Unlike her local doctor, the king's surgeon was skeptical, and after discovering corn inside the stomach of one of the rabbits and hay in their droppings, it proved the animal hadn't developed inside Mary. Eventually, Mary Toft admitted to the hoax and explained that she had manually inserted the animals inside her to make the delivery as realistic as possible. She was immediately imprisoned for fraud, and the medical community was ridiculed for having been fooled. Thanks so much for watching, guys. I'm Kennedy. If you liked this video, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time.
Want to see more videos like this one? Check out this video next. This video is about real encounters with demons from the Bible that will leave you shaking from head to toe. Are you too scared to check it out? Click the video now. Viewer discretion is heavily advised.